Polytheistic worlds are relatively common in fantasy, especially if that world is related or inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Whether that be due to a human fascination with the ancient religions of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Greeks, or a general distaste for Christian-styled monotheism among many of the fantasy heavyweights, not including Tolkien and Lewis in that particular discussion, but that's beside the point. Gods in our fantasy worlds are largely part of a pantheon, with specific domains related to their authority and their worship. At a glance, Kelemvor of the Forgotten Realms may look an awful lot like Anubis. Both judge dead folks, and both use scales to do so. But in actual fact, the way that Western-styled fantasy treats polytheism is extraordinarily alien to the ways that polytheism has historically existed in our world. A lot of fantasy polytheism is its own deeply weird thing, with its own set of rules and norms. And if you don't believe me, let me try and convince you. The first distinction between real polytheism and fantasy polytheism is, in some ways, an obvious one. In fantasy polytheism, magic is often attained through worship. Now, there are some worlds that play with this idea. I especially like the world of A Song of Ice and Fire for this, even though the majority of faith systems George R. R. Martin explores in that work are somewhat monotheistic. But on the whole, in fantasy, adherents to a faith are often granted some sort of divine or magical power. In other words, the gods are both immanent and active, far much more so than in our own world and our own history. There is quite literally evidence that the gods have and give power in the form of divine magic in many fantasy worlds. There should be nearly no questions whether the gods are real or powerful if it is widely accepted that they so regularly influence the world. Indeed, once Bebo, the god of rebirth, brings one hero back from the dead, this deed will spread as legend, and Bebo's veneration will be ensured amongst anyone who hears about it. You see, in a traditional polytheistic system, Bebo would then have venerations, rituals, and ritual acts done in their name, whether out of hope for their favour, recognition of their existence, or a respectful desire to be left alone in the case that one does not want to be associated with any sort of rebirth. This is the critical thing. For the vast majority of fantasy polytheists, they should, by all rights, be trying to at least appease most of their fantasy pantheon, or at least the main ones who rule the important domains to that person's life. This doesn't happen quite as often as you think. We see adherents of one particular god being quite stoic in their worship of this one particular god, and not really straying too much further, due to perhaps limitations in world-building scope, or just a misunderstanding of what polytheism really is. It's showing respect for any god, any power that can influence your life. There are a couple of things about fantasy polytheism that this further highlights. First, many fantasy pantheons have gods who are coded with rather evil domains. This happens in our world too. Hades, Set, and Shiva are all pretty good examples of gods with some rather dark domains. Yet all of these deities had, and continue to have in some cases, healthy followings. The important thing to note is that each god has a critical role in their domains in their pantheon. Hades rules the underworld, where every single mortal will eventually go. Set was the lord of deserts, storms, and foreigners, which was very important in the metropolitan but deeply environmentally troubled ancient Egypt, as well as being associated with disorder and violence. And Shiva is the destroyer in the Hindu faith, and yet is one of the most worshipped deities, as destruction is seen as a necessary part of the process of creation in that faith. This is critical to understanding real-world polytheism. In the Forgotten Realms, as our example, there are some inconsistencies with the presentation of polytheism, which kind of lead to a failure, or at least a jarring of the system. Baal, in that system, is the lord of murder and the ritualistic killing of people. Baal would, in most polytheistic circles, not be a major deity, unless ritual murder just so happened to be that particular faith's favourite pastime. You see, in D&D's Forgotten Realms, a god's power is directly tied to their influence and their worshipful following. Baal has very little going for them, unless you're a murderer or a priest who does ritual sacrifices on the regular. You have really no reason to venerate or worship Baal. You may think, well, offering the Lord of Murder my veneration might mean that I, don't get murdered. I'm under his protection. But that's actually not a thing that Baal is known for at all. In other words, a normal person, one who doesn't seek the death or ritual murder of another individual, has absolutely no reason to ever call upon Baal. This god would be forgotten in all but the most niche and dark and dangerous of situations, and therefore, by the logic of his own world's existence, his power is probably not that great, unless we expect a society of mad folk who just love killing. The major evil gods in all polytheistic faiths are those whose domains touch on things that are nearly universal to the human experience. The seas, harvest, death and the afterlife, war and hunting. Or they are gods who sit at intersections of massive cultural significance, like Shiva. So if everyone generally just venerates a whole bunch of major deities and some minor ones as suits, why do we see throughout history priests of specific deities within polytheism? Well, for the major gods who people are sacrificing and praying to often, it's very, very important to get it right. You see, in real-world polytheism, the guardians of the sacred and niche and specific knowledge of ritual were the people to go to when you wanted to properly venerate a certain deity. They can tell you what sacrifices the god will like, how to do it exactly right, and what seasonal or weather changes might affect the god's whims and wants. Essentially, they did everything possible to make sure that your prayer or your request would be heard by their specialist subject, their god. They were essentially qualified experts in what one specific god wanted in terms of ritual actions and prayer. In much of fantasy, this is not quite the same. A priest who has their god's favour will often actually be able to intervene much more directly in helping people who have problems. Instead of giving a qualified expert's best version of the offering to a certain deity and hoping that that offering is enough, that the goddess takes pity on you and allows your daughter to recover from her illness, a fantasy priest may well simply go to the child's home and heal the child directly in the name of their god. Therefore, while real-world polytheism sees normal people venerating as many gods as are relevant to Then, while some priestly cults devote themselves to the learning and proper ritual practices of a specific deity, fantasy polytheism encourages a much more direct connection, more akin to the charismatic prophets of a deity than a deity's qualified experts. It's very likely that we see regular folk acting in a traditionally polytheistic manner, while avoiding those deities who have literally no functionality or purpose in their domains that affects their day-to-day life, like, lords of murder, gods of undeath, and family and certain species' personal gods that they have no attachment to. We'll get to that later. But it's also likely that cults of charisma are much, much more likely to spring up around certain chosen followers of a deity. At best, this might result in kind of cultic behaviours and the springing up of a system that is somewhat like the Christian sainthood system around these charismatic problem solvers. But at worst, we might see the whole structure of polytheism fall to pieces. Certainly in a D&D based world, a powerful cleric of any deity is able to solve any normal problem of any normal person with their wide-ranging magical talents. In this situation, the sensible thing is not to venerate a wide swath of gods if you're a normal person, but rather to seek the direct and specific favour of the god or cleric of said god who has helped you the most. At this point, for all, except those whose lives depend on multiple distinct domains, like for example a wine merchant with a family who ships wine overseas. They might need gods with authority over the harvest, over commerce, over the family, over seas and good weather. But for everyone else, following a charismatic cult will often be good enough. And maybe, just maybe, every so often, they could throw in a veneration for a god of good weather, good fortune, or a god of family. The final piece to the polytheistic puzzle is a feature present in every major polytheistic religion throughout human history, but which fails to make an appearance in enough fantasy literature: the little guys. See, unless your fantasy world is created by some sort of world-building masochist, it can't come close to the variety and scope present in real-world polytheistic faith. There are, quite literally, countless gods. Some of the most famous but lesser known Roman deities are the gods of entryways, doors, and hinges. All three of which are three separate deities in the Roman belief structure. But this is really just scratching the surface. Specific families had their own deities or guardian spirits. Specific landscape features had their own gods or spirits, as did all manner of mundane objects and mundane processes. Heck, even people can be gods. The Greek demigods had cultic power, and Roman emperors were deified upon their death. Even people just from mythology can become gods, from Sun Wukong to Gilgamesh. My point is that most worlds simply can't afford the effort it takes to flesh out an actual polytheistic system. As to do so, you need to generate a grand, vast tapestry of all of these hundreds and hundreds of little guys, or at least make it feel like you've done that. Pratchett does the latter suggestion well. Sure, he has a lot of words across the many Discworld books to build up all of these niche, intricate little Easter eggs, if you'd like. But he does make the world feel rich, with mini gods and mini traditions. To its credit, D&D, or at least some D&D settings, also involve certain niche deities. Many species have their own divine shepherds or divine creators, and the Kuo-toa are notable for their power to collectively imagine their own deities into existence, leading to myriad extant minor curiosities. And that's rather the point. To build a solid polytheistic fantasy system, you kinda need either a collection of world builders working tirelessly in the same space, or a mind capable of storing all of the myriad bizarre lore and realities and facts of life in your world, while keeping that in mind enough to allow you to make stuff up as you go along that doesn't contradict something that already exists. And regrettably, if a fantasy tale isn't about gods, faith, or polytheism, that work probably shouldn't be done. So what is fantasy polytheism? Well, it's a system where heroes and priests of high enough power and magic can grant the often minor requests, needs, and hopes that regular people have for their gods. But also a system where gods are not just present parts of the world, but active agents with demonstrable favour and power and curses. In this framework, minor gods and household helpers, as brownies and hobgoblins once were in British folklore, are either left by the wayside or transformed from hopeful explanations of good luck and good fortune into real, fantastical beasts and monsters. And often worlds where the gods don't even need to be helpful in their domains or authorities for people to worship them, because they exist. And so folks simply need to have a reason to at least fear, respect, or venerate them. I guess fear could be considered an offering of sorts. In short, it's a lopsided pantheon, tinged with an even stronger sense of the charismatic cult, while deities can exist entirely independent of the populace's need to venerate them. Here, gods are not created to fulfill a specific need, function, or domain. In many fantasy cases, it's the other way round. That's not polytheism, at least as we know it. I don't know what to call it. Maybe it's a form of charismatic henotheism. But either way, it's a unique feature of fantasy. And I find it utterly fascinating that fantasy polytheism is simply not like anything we have in our world. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed that deep dive into a rather complex and fraught topic. If you have, or you have any thoughts on this matter, please do let me know in the comments. I really enjoy talking about some of these more thorny, complex issues within fantasy. And if you have any suggestions for what sort of thing I should talk about next, please also get down in the comments. And subscribe if you want to see more videos in this vein. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I have been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.